I'm Colin Hambrook, editor of Disability Arts Online. I'm an older white individual sporting glasses and a lockdown beard. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this first in our series of artist presentations. In response to the unprecedented situation caused by the coronavirus outbreak hitting the Disability Arts Online community and adversely affecting both disabled people and the self-employed, we introduced a new commissions pot for disabled artists. One strand of our COVID commissions includes a series of artist presentations to be engaged with from the comfort of your own home. The talks explore a range of arts practice, visual arts, theatre, playwriting, spoken word and music, intertwined with concerns related to the lived experience of disability. It will be a groundbreaking, informative and entertaining series to engage and question aspects of disability arts practice in these difficult times. We begin our series of fortnightly talks and presentations with Jamie Hale, Reading AIDS Literature in a Time of Pandemic, exploring what we can learn from the chroniclers of the era when the AIDS crisis hit North America and Europe from the late 1980s into the 1990s. Jamie Hale is a writer, actor, director and multidisciplinary artist whose work has been showcased at the Tate Modern, South Bank Centre and Barbican Centre, Cryptic 2019. They work at the intersection of disability arts and health policy and are currently training with Grey Eye Ensemble and writing poetry and for television. Visually, the talk consists of Jamie talking to camera with intermittent slides which they read out. Jamie is a young white individual with short dark red hair, facial stubble and glasses, with their head against the headrest of an electric wheelchair. Send your questions for Jamie to answer in the Q&A section via the Facebook or YouTube comments sections or the hashtag #DAOCOVID Commissions. So now I'm going to hand over to Jamie and I will see you again at the end for the Q&A session.
Hi, my name is Jamie Hale and this talk is called, as shown on the current slide, Borrowing Time, Reading AIDS Literature in a Time of Pandemic. The next slide shows the poem AIDS Disappearance by Joan Retallack. For Stephen Fitterman, 1. In contrast with the demand of continuity in the customary description, 2, of nature, the indivisibility of the quantum of action requires an essential, 3, element of discontinuity, especially apparent through the discussion of the 4, nature of light. She said it's so odd to be dying and laughed, still it's early. 5, late, the beauty of nature as the moon waxes, turns to terror when it wanes. 6, or during eclipse, or when changing seasons change, making certain things, 7, disappear, and there is no place to stand on, and strangely we're glad. This is from Procedural Elegies by Joan Retallack. The poem continues, repeating itself, only next time every A, I, D, or S is removed. The next repetition, the contagion has spread to the letters that neighbour AIDS, and there is no B, H, J, C, E, R, or T. As it repeats itself over and over, the letters become contagious and disappear themselves, spreading outwards until only the numbers remain. That contagion reflects that of the virus in a conceptual approach to literature. When it feels like the world is on fire, a lot of people have turned to art, and specifically the recreation of art, the reappropriation of it, interpreting it in order to apply it to today's experiences. From the Getty Challenge, with people recreating famous paintings in their homes, to the surge of interest in past pandemic writing, such as Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, about the 1918 flu epidemic. Art has provided people with some sort of sense of connection to different time and place, and a feeling that this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. When I think about epidemic art, the first thing that comes to mind is the massive variety of work produced during the Western AIDS epidemic, by young men, usually, who were watching their friends and lovers die, expecting to die themselves. For many of these writers, the AIDS epidemic was their first main engagement with the fact of their own mortality, and their writing reflected that, trying to understand what life and death really meant to them before they and their friends, lovers, and chosen family died. AIDS didn't consciously select gay men, but it arrived in a community where it spread rapidly. In the USA, it also disproportionately hit haemophiliacs, sex workers, and people from Haiti. It is now epidemic across much of Africa, where effective treatments are priced out of the hands of normal people. In the UK, it disproportionately impacts on men who have sex with men, heterosexual Black Africans, and people who inject drugs. The work I've chosen to discuss here comes primarily from an American perspective and from the 1980s and early to mid-1990s. It doesn't reflect the whole of the AIDS crisis by any means, but speaks to me nonetheless. COVID-19 also strikes different communities differently. In the UK, BAME people are at a higher risk of contracting it and experiencing complications, while disabled people with immune and respiratory complications, amongst others, and elderly people are also at a very high risk. The disproportionate burden of risk I faced made me very anxious in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. I had no idea how it was really transmitted, how contagious it was, or how to protect myself, especially with carers constantly present. When I first found AIDS literature, I was ill at university myself, and when I first found and for the first time was actively engaging with my own lack of immortality and the deconstruction that my body was undergoing. Something in AIDS literature spoke to me then, the fear of what would come next, the honest appraisal of the self. Returning to it now, these things still strike me, but so does the broader context to which these writers refer and discuss. So I'm exploring it, trying to understand how people lived through that pandemic. We're not experiencing an AIDS-like pandemic now. For the vast majority of people, they're facing a bad flu, but the media environment and the heightened fear for those at heightened risk have created a space where people sometimes realise that even if they survive, their families might not. For some already at a higher risk, we are forced to face a new threat to our lives, a new angle from which death could approach. Obviously, AIDS was very different from COVID-19, wiping out entire communities, a near-death sentence in the early years. I don't want to appropriate the experiences of the authors when COVID-19 is far less fatal, far less targeted, and far less likely to kill not only you, but all of your friends and lovers. You don't live with it for years waiting to die. Without saying these things are comparable, I want to look through writing from the epidemic, exploring what it means to read it and take advice from it now. I will explore a variety of texts in this talk, which I am now displaying on the PowerPoint, and are Borrowed Time by Paul Monette. Published in 1988, Borrowed Time was one of the earliest AIDS autobiographies, tracking the last 2 years of Paul's partner Roger Horwitz's life. Last Watch of the Night by Paul Monette, published in 1994. Last Watch of the Night is a collection of essays, too personal and otherwise. Love Alone by Paul Monette, published in 1988, is a book of 18 elegies for Rog, written by Monette in the months after Roger died. Heaven's Coast by Mark Doty, published in 1996. Heaven's Coast is Mark Doty's memoir from the AIDS crisis, focused on his life with his partner Wally as Wally died. Poets for Life, 76 Poets Respond to AIDS, edited by Michael Klein, published in 1989, so again reasonably early in the epidemic. This brought together a mixture of poets, male and female, HIV positive and negative, with and without AIDS, and with differing relations to the crisis, to write poems to raise money for the PEN Emergency Fund for Writers and Editors with AIDS. Things Shaped in Passing, edited by Michael Klein and Richard Howard, published in 1997. This is a sequel to Poets for Life, and collects together further work exploring the epidemic from a different and more broadly historical perspective. The Man with the Night Sweats by Tom Gunn. Published in 1992, this collection concludes with a section exploring friends who had died of AIDS. For me, my connection with AIDS literature began with Borrowed Time, which I read while bedbound and seriously ill, then read over and over and over. It's a book I always return to when I'm looking for comfort during illness, looking to see that other people have traced difficult paths, have looked death in the eye over and over, and have come back to the arms of their lovers. I'm exploring themes that I've encountered within AIDS literature without wishing to imply that that is in any way parallel to COVID-19. Literature and art contain a multitude of experiences, and when feeling pain can be an important place to turn to for reassurance. Recognizing my emotions in those described in some of these works has supported me enormously. I hope it can do the same for you. The importance of finding peace in moments of everyday life. In the chaos and crisis of pandemic, combined with the isolation of social distancing, it can feel like we're careening between heightened crisis and desperate boredom, our emotions enthralled to the news cycle, the changing restrictions, the medical information emerging. Paul Monette's Borrowed Time is full of crisis and of the monotony of hospital rooms, but one of the things he emphasizes throughout the book is the moments of peace he found. Even when he describes himself as spinning out, he and Roger found these moments and spent them together, letting them reserve and regenerate their strength. One of the main spaces of peace was their garden, but they also managed to create this in the relative peace of a hospital room, the space not mattering as long as they were together. As well as these spaces of outer peace that they create, finding inner peace was also important to them. Paul writes about Roger, as displayed on the slide. It's with a certain awe I look back and see how balanced and focused he stayed, even as he gathered and husbanded his strength. He took refuge now in his temperate nature, a capacity for quietness that began as instinct and ended as character. This is one of the sections of the book I hold on to, because from reading it, we can see that it was this temperate nature that held Paul and Roger together when things were difficult. This next slide has a stanza from Rilke's Notebooks, August 2014, thinking about the idea of the house within. I'm anxious, and a house abides within me. I'm careful, and my safety has no fears. My love, who I've become, inside me dwells the image of all beauty, streaming tears. It's obvious that Roger had something similar, a sense of internal refuge. As I read Paul Monette's Book of Elegies, Love Alone, I read a description he wrote of Roger, shown on the slide. Roger Horwitz, my beloved friend, died on the 22nd of October 1986 after 19 months of fighting the ravages of AIDS. He was 44 years old, the happiest man I ever knew. He fought with an immensity of spirit that transfigured us who loved him. On his grave are Plato's last words on Socrates, the wisest and justest and best. I am reminded of the need to develop that capacity, to find that inner peace within myself when the world is terrifying, to be poised and to be the wisest, justest, and best version of myself I can be. This writing reminds me that finding moments of peace is an active decision one makes. They're not something that come to you unasked unless you're open to finding them. I'm also doing the work of looking for these moments amidst the epidemic. Knowing that other people have done this gives me hope. Monette writes in Borrowed Time, shown on the next slide, that as we drove home along sunset, he sighed with pleasure at the open window, feeling the green of spring rush by. There are moments of reprieve that are a bit happier than anything else in life. He also writes about another epidemic in 2GB from Tuscany, published in Poets for Life. Wondering what's left beside us and how much time, I stare at the bright fall of morning on the grey-blue columns of Santo Spirito, the calm stone of Brunelleschi, washed smooth in a river of mind over matter. I can't tell you how much you would like today. The pomegranates heaped in baskets air drowsy with wood smoke. Last night, a wind down the Arno that set the moon's teeth on edge. In 1348, the plague took a third of Florence. 4 out of 5 in Siena, and there were no baths to close. Or even more naked still, the courtiers in striped tights and codpieces strutting in the Piccolomini frescoes, as if they didn't inhabit an age of blood that ate young men for breakfast. Which of the painters of the 1300s, who can keep them straight, got left behind in 48? Next time I promise that we'll go together. His parallels of the 1348 plague and the AIDS crisis, the age of blood that ate young men for breakfast, is deftly and beautifully done in a poem that is both poignant and gentle. The grey-blue columns of Santo Spirito, the calm stone of Brunelleschi. His early writing after Roger's death is frenzied and furious, but in this slightly later work, he is reaching for a sense of peace in his still descriptions of nature and architecture. Moments of peace also rush through Mark Doty's Heaven's Coast like a myth, a dream, or a wild river. Heaven's Coast refuses to hold on to one mood for too long, but brings out anger and humour, and then sadness, touching on something deep, profound, and peaceful. The part which I keep coming back to as I approach 2 months with one brief trip outdoors to go to the hospital is the vital description of nature at the end. Doty harks back to Whitman's Leaves of Grass as he writes about grass showing that there is no final death, that it keeps growing and growing, and about seeing a coyote and knowing that coyote came from Wally, his dead partner. This is shown on the next slide. The coyote stared back at us, and I could imagine in that gaze Wally's look toward home, his old home, from the other world, not sad exactly, but as neutral, curious, loving, accepting. The dead regard us, I think, as animals do, and perhaps that is part of their relationship. They want nothing from us, and they are a pure presence. They look back to us from a world we can't begin to comprehend. I am going on, the gaze said, in a life apart from yours, a good life, a wild life, unbound. This slight supernaturality, this mythic coyote that may or may not have existed, this immortality of grass even as blades of it die, unite nature and peace as a sense of acceptance in Mark Doty's work. In another of his poems, shown on the next slide, Tiara, which was published in Poets for Life, he says, I think he's into the salt tide of wanting as much as he wanted, giving himself over so drunk or stoned it almost didn't matter who, though they were beautiful, stampeding into him in the simple, ravishing music of their hurry. I think heaven is perfect stasis, poised over the realms of desire where dreaming and waking men lie on the grass, while wet horses roam around them, huge fragments of the music we die into in the body's paradise. This compares nicely with the wildness that he found in Heaven's Coast, but both of these also have a sense of being outside time, moments poised and always waiting to move. His gaze at death, but also his gaze at stillness and peace running through them. Perhaps that perfect stasis is the acceptance being immovable and heaven spinning around that. As well as the gaze at death in this is that gaze at stillness and peace. And reading these, I try to almost meditate and find my own sense of stillness, my own coyote. The next message I took is that illness is always political, that who lives and who dies is political. We see this in COVID-19, where BAME communities that have been underserved by the medical professional for a long time are far more likely to die. We also see it with the threats not to prioritise disabled people for ventilation, with the email I received from my doctor telling me that what makes me vulnerable to COVID-19 would also make me low priority for ventilation. In Last Watch of the Night, Monette says of his desire to have died of homophobia, died a hero on the gravestone of a later partner, Stephen Colzac. The quote shown on the following slide it seemed the least I could give him by way of defiance, since he had made it clear often enough that he wanted his body dumped on the White House lawn, and indeed in 1992, protesters scattered the ashes of men who had died of AIDS on the lawn of the White House. Writers from the epidemic were very aware that the number of deaths wasn't accidental. It was the result of governments refusing to face the scale of the AIDS crisis and seeing its victims as expendable. Similarly, with COVID-19, where the UK appears to have the highest number of excess deaths in Europe, there was a strong sense that the government deliberately ignored the scale of the epidemic before implementing protective measures too little, too late. The scale of infection is so much bigger and of death so much smaller than the AIDS epidemic, but this literature reminds us to be angry. Monette writes in Last Watch of the Night, shown on the slide, "I will probably die without forgiving anyone. It's been engraved too long on my brain that my epitaph should proclaim, died of homophobia, murdered by his government. Still room, of course, for a line or two of uplift, a scrap of Shakespeare, but I haven't settled on that yet. My heart is too exhausted to sustain the bitterness anymore, not even against the calumnies of my enemies." Reading that, I'm reminded of healthcare workers who screamed about the lack of PPE and then died of COVID-19 themselves. Dr. Chowdhury wrote to Johnson demanding more PPE and died a few weeks later. It isn't enough to clap or raise candles or raise money. I am reminded by Monette that instead we should be raising anger, raising hell, dumping ashes outside the Houses of Parliament, and trying to wrestle for a media narrative that acknowledges that certain people have been designated expendable. Monette follows that section in the book with, as shown on the next slide, "We queers on Revelation Hill, tucking our skirts about us so as not to touch our Mormon neighbours, died of the greed of power, because we were expendable. If you mean to visit any of us, it had better be to make you strong to fight that power. Take your languor and easy tears somewhere else. Above all, don't pretty us up. Tell yourself none of this ever had to happen, and then go and make it stop with whatever breath you have next. Grief is a sword, or it is nothing." During this epidemic, key workers have been designated as expendable, and as have many disabled people, with people starving hungry due to a lack of online shopping slots, dying after being turned away from hospital, or dying in care homes when hospitals, even those with beds, refuse them. These apparently expendable key workers have simultaneously been called heroes and therefore martyrs. If someone is a hero and a martyr, they died for their country, rather than having been killed by a lack of preparation, a lack of appropriate treatment, a lack of PPE. In the preface to Love Alone, Paul Monette writes, as shown on the next slide, "Wilfred Owen's preface to the poems he wrote in 1917 and 1918 is the best caution I know against beauty and eloquence. He begs us not to read his anthem for the doomed youth of his generation as a decorous celebration of heroes. I do not presume on the nightmare of Owen's war. May the boys of Flanders be spared all comparison, and I don't pretend to have written the anthem of my people. The story that endlessly eludes the decorum of the press is the death of a generation of gay men. What is written here is only one man's passing and one man's cry, a warrior burying a warrior. May it fuel the fire of those on the front lines who mean to prevail, and of their friends who stand in the fire with them." Monette writes in the preface to Love Alone about a warrior burying a warrior, and about how with words he could empty my Uzi into the air and those on the front lines. His refusal to allow comparison to the World War I poets is powerful, even as he wants to reference them, something I'm interested in here. Many criticisms are made about the language of war as applied to an illness, but here there is a profound difference. In this AIDS literature, the language of war was applied by writers to their own experiences, while with COVID-19, we are calling frontline workers heroes and martyrs as a way of making their deaths a sacrifice rather than the result of political action and inaction. People in care homes aren't even talked about as a sacrifice because they're not talked about at all. Patients were discharged from hospital to infect entire care homes, killing tens of thousands, and it's barely noticed. Grief is a sword, or it is nothing. We haven't lost entire communities, as happened in the AIDS crisis, but we have been reminded that the government would have been happy to lose us, that they didn't see disabled people as a priority at all. During the AIDS crisis, art was a focus for communities, and Michael Klein's Poets for Life, 76 Poets Respond to AIDS, demonstrates this. When it was published, it was still early in the epidemic, though some 4 years after AZT, the first effective treatment, started to be trialled on AIDS patients. There had been poetry workshops recording and producing poetry of various quality and emotional resonance, and there had been individual collections and other efforts. But with Poets for Life, Michael Klein saw himself creating something like the AIDS Memorial quilt, where 100,000 people sewed memorial patches for people they'd lost to AIDS, by bringing something similar together, only in the form of poetry. He wrote to 300 poets, inviting them to submit work for this, and many of those poets had never written about the AIDS epidemic before. They were being invited to donate their work to raise money for a fund for writers and editors with AIDS, but also, by doing that, to donate their names to a cause which was nothing if not political. In his introduction to the book, Klein wrote, shown on the next slide, as it has diminished community after community, AIDS has also strangely united us. As it has summoned still more fear and uncertainty in the way we live, AIDS has revealed more courage and understanding about how we affect each other. The issues AIDS insists we confront are the most timeless and immediate of all. The battle between love and death. None of us is immune. None of us is exempt from that battle. No one is immune. This book was a form of community building, but the communities it recognises sound familiar to me now, brought up as it was around neighbourhood organisers. When I think of local mutual aid groups, people running errands for strangers, starting to operate field kitchens for medical staff, and generally demonstrating solidarity and support. While Klein described these poets as providing a kind of historical text to the epidemic, in writing for Poets for Life, they weren't just a historical text, but part of a present, in the same way that the AIDS Memorial quilt formed part of a present. It was not only the percent of the hundreds and thousands of people out there for whom a quilt panel was sewn, but also the present of the hundreds of thousands of people who contributed to sewing quilt panels, leaving part or all of their present there, not just an item of historical record. In one of the other poems in Poets for Life, Felice Picano's An Artist's Life, shown on the slide, the poet writes, because he'd always considered himself an artist, it wasn't easy to ignore the appearance of purple spots on his legs. At first he thought them garish, violets or not, a spatter of perfect tan. It was only months later, describing his unasked for tattoos grown now to foliage, that he learned the truth, had made good for decades of failure, and let a dank, graceless virus develop, artistic to the last, upon the blank, waiting photoplate of his life. This poem turned the tumours of Kaposki's sarcoma into tattoos. Finding art amidst a crisis is challenging, but this reinventation of the ill body as art allowed an expansion of the space between art and illness. This is something I've longed to see emerge, but this is something I've longed to see emerge in art from the coronavirus epidemic, and something I'm expecting to see increasing amounts of. In the sequel to Poets for Life, edited by Michael Klein and Richard Howard, is Tim Dlugos' C9, a poem called Things Shaped in Passing. It contains the quote, "What we have to cherish is not only what we can recall of how things were before the plague, but how we responded once it started. People have been great to me. An avalanche of love has come my way since I got sick, and not just moral support. Even while remembering the political nature of illness, this also reminds us of what communities can become and do. Fourthly, it's important to acknowledge the presence of death. In Western society, the tradition is to avoid death. It has its rituals, but shouldn't be invited into one's life. Relatives should be mourned, but not too much. Life is for the living. I was struck by David Trinidad's Driving Back from New Haven, from Poets for Life, shown on the slide. We haven't talked about his health the entire trip. How does it make you feel, I ask? Like I want to live until they discover a cure, he snaps. We travel in silence for a while. I stare out the window at all the green trees on the Meadow Parkway. Then he says, I resent it. I resent that we were not raised with an acceptance of death, and here it is all around us, and I fucking resent it. I resent that we do not know how to die. Similarly, Marie Howe writes in The Promise from Things Shaped in Passing, shown on the slide, in the dream I had when he came back not sick, but whole and wearing his winter coat, he looked at me, as if there were no law against it, a membrane he could not break. His silence was what he could not do, not like our breathing in the world, like our living, as we do in time. And I told him, I'm reading all of this Buddhist stuff. And listen, we don't die when we die. Death is an event, a threshold we pass through. We go on and into light forever. And he looked down and then back up at me. It was the look we'd pass across the table when Dad was drunk again and very dangerous. The level look that wants to tell you something. By acknowledging the way that death followed them, these poets were pushing back against a society that minimised it. After Roger's funeral, in the poetry collection Love Alone, in The Very Same, Monette quotes his cousin, shown on the slide. The wrongest of wrong things said that day, as I stepped from the chapel, an innocent cousin once removed jiggled my shoulder, time to turn the page, intoned like it's all been so appalling. We must hasten now to the land of brunch, there to recover our BMWs, our zest for winning and half-acre closets. Sorry, I'm booked weeks later, still fuming with retorts. But this is my page, it cannot be turned. The idea that death can be briefly acknowledged and moved on from was challenged hugely by these communities full of death. The AIDS memorial quilt was a permanence of acknowledgement, and much of the art comes from a conscious facing of death, which is something I have strongly learned from in how I consider my own mortality. Next, there are different models of closeness. In the UK, it was apparently a watershed moment when Princess Diana shook hands with men dying of AIDS, acknowledging, as she did, that physical contact wasn't inherently dangerous. Nowadays, it is very possible to be HIV positive but on treatment and unable to transmit the virus. But during the height of the epidemic, people knew that sex was the primary way it was transmitted. Yet many people at a distance from the crisis were terrified to even touch someone new. The negotiation around fear but need for contact runs through work from this time, whether criticising people who refuse to even share cutlery with someone HIV positive or navigating sexual closeness. As Mark Doty wrote in Fugue, in Things Shaped in Passing, shown on the slide, his landlord doesn't want him back. His sisters dropped him on the side of the highway at a rest stop, his clothes in 3 flowered yellow pillowcases. My mother, he says, doesn't want me crying in the house. She doesn't want my tears around. She fed him on paper plates, kept his laundry separate, and didn't tell his father the diagnosis. We say, of course he can stay. This fear of contact and enforced distance left people isolated, hurting, with nowhere to go. Communities tried to find other models of closeness and navigate what safety meant. In Things Shaped in Passing, Christopher Davis writes in Duende, shown on the slide, after a late stiff lunch, I lay back and let a sick man tenderize me, licking my shoulder blades, my navel, my asshole, opening my body's envelope, consuming the glue, sheathing my flesh opener inside his cheeks, waif like I prayed. Do you think it's all right? your saliva. I think so, he smiled. Don't do something you don't want to do. I touched his bald spot from his cockpit. Ghostly honey oozed slowly to the white shroud. My white teardrop plopped on my navel. In this pandemic, locked down, sometimes alone or alone except for carers and housemates, the world can feel very disconnected, leaving us starved of comfort and connection. However, just as the poetry shows a navigation of risk and contact, and the importance of having contact in safe ways is something that moves through AIDS literature, and I've seen disabled people exploring new modes of contact and communication in this pandemic. Finally, we have a shared responsibility for each other. While AIDS hit communities that were often tightly bound in themselves, the effects of COVID-19 hit more diffusive communities and those that are extremely tightly bound. That, combined with the highly infective nature of the epidemic, have prevented the same personal physical care that people could provide each other in the AIDS crisis. Instead of that, there's risen lots of interconnected networks of support, mutual aid groups, online gatherings. These have substituted for a physical community, but I'm also reminded of that often unmet physical need for support in Tom Gunn's The Man with the Night Stretch. In Memory Unsettled, shown on the next slide, he writes, "Your pain still hangs in air, sharp motes of it suspended, the voice of your despair that also is not ended. When near your death a friend asked you what he could do. Remember me, you said, we will remember you. Once when you went to see another with a fever in a like hospital bed with a terrible hothouse cough and terrible hothouse shiver that soaked him and then dried him, and you perceived that he had to be comforted. You climbed in there beside him and hugged him plain in view, that you were sick enough and had your own fears too." The generosity of offering this comfort despite one's own fears characterizes a sense of responsibility for one's community and a desire to give support and comfort. As people, even with responsibility, even when we're deeply suffering, we have this responsibility. As statements, they might sound almost facile. Find peace, illness is political, build communities, make art, acknowledge the presence of death. There are different models of closeness. We have a shared responsibility for one another, but these are things I've learned from the art of a different people, facing a different epidemic. I will ensure that grief is a sword. I will try to live with mortality, and I will remember that Monette ended the preface to Love Alone with, as shown on the slide, "We will not be bowed down or erased by this. I learned too well what it means to be a people, learned in the joy of my best friend what all the meaningless pain and horror cannot take away, that there is love, pity us not." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I was very pleased that Disability Arts Online commissioned this artist presentation, especially having been so moved by your Crips Against Constraints piece, When We Got Sick, commissioned by Grey Eye recently, which I guess was an outcome of this same research that you're doing into AIDS literature. I was interested to know how important it's been for you writing in response to the literature of the AIDS crisis and how it's helped you to move your writing practice along.
It's had a really significant impact on me and on my writing practice. I think I was 13 and kind of in the process of coming out to myself when I lost an older online friend to AIDS, and it left a real impact on me. And then moving in gay communities from 16, 17, with a lot of friends and acquaintances who'd lost a lot of people to AIDS in the AIDS crisis and beyond. But I only really encountered the literature when I was looking for experiences in literature that reflected some of my emotions and challenges around disability. And I found the honest navigations of grief, mortality, and love in AIDS literature to be both really profound and really relevant for me in understanding how you can keep living amidst catastrophe. I think a lot of writing about disability by non-disabled people quite quickly tips into tropes of pity and misery. And I was very moved by Paul Monette's work and by the quote I finished the talk with, "All there is love, pity us not." The fact that they were able to engage with such traumatic themes and engage and confront medical themes without a request for sympathy or pity, just a straightforward challenge to people to look unflinchingly at reality. So I've taken that forward into my own writing as much as I can. It's the only real body of work I've found that deals with being young and sick without being inspiration porn, and that's always been really important to me.
I can really see how that writing would resonate now. I was in a gay relationship through my 20s, and I remember well the fear and terrible homophobia that the AIDS syndrome brought to bear, and the hateful headlines culminating in the Section 28 made law in 1988, forbidding the publishing of material with the intention of, inverted commas, promoting homosexuality. Section 28 was the kind of apotheosis of societal homophobia. Much of the literature you refer to was published in defiance of that societal disapproval. And I wonder what your research and the writers and poets you've been looking at had to say, looking outwards to the kind of oppression from governments and from society in general.
I mean, most of the literature that I have been reading and researching has been American, but certainly there was a massive atmosphere of inflamed homophobia at the time, which I think Paul Monette confronts a lot more in his poetry and his later book of essays, Last Watch of the Night, than he does in Borrowed Time. But he very much holds to blame governments for not responding more quickly, for refusing to acknowledge the epidemic, and for viewing the often gay or drug users or people of colour who had AIDS as being in somehow at fault for their own behaviours, rather than people who had developed it. And he massively challenges this, making quite extensive and drawn out Holocaust comparisons, in particular between the American government's response to AIDS and the Nazi government in Germany. These are obviously not above criticism, but I think they exemplify the strength of feeling he had when he won the National Book Award in the early 1990s with his other autobiography, Becoming a Man, of his life pre-Roger and pre-AIDS crisis. His speech was a matter of great contention between him and the Libraries of Congress, because he spoke about how silence had allowed the AIDS crisis to become as severe as it did. Because he was one of the earlier chroniclers of the crisis, and because he was willing to go up in front of the press again and again, he experienced a lot of homophobia. He did a lot of call-in radio, got a lot of, I guess, what we'd now call hate mail, just for being willing to be so loud about it at a time when people weren't being allowed to be. So I think no.
And you talk about the extra pressures and risk placed on BAME communities, and I wondered if amongst the AIDS literature that you're researching, you found work representing the voices of the Black experience of the AIDS crisis.
In terms of Black writers, I think probably the most prominent that comes to mind is Essex Hemphill, whose work Ceremonies was pretty groundbreaking. And then more recently, people like the poet Dana Smith, who writes about being Black and HIV positive. In terms of people of colour more broadly, people like Timothy Liu and Rafael Ocampo come to mind as sort of non-white writers responding to the AIDS pandemic. Publishing and writing at the time in America were very white dominated, and similarly a lot of the writing in response to the AIDS crisis is from men who were reasonably well off prior to the AIDS crisis, and for whom they were able to develop writing careers. You see far less published work by people of colour or BAME people and by poorer and working class people. And I suspect that that's a result of the prejudices inherent in publishing, both then and now.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about your talk and the relationships that you draw on between that time in the 80s and early 90s and the current pandemic, and it seems to me that one of the key differences between the AIDS crisis and the current pandemic is that whilst AIDS brought the visibility of gay communities to the fore, and those communities responded by forcing society into a confrontation with their prejudice, it feels like the current situation has pushed disabled communities further back into a state of invisibility. No one is reporting or resisting the coronavirus bill, which makes legal obligation for authorities to provide care services very precarious at the moment. So I wondered what you think we can learn from the past for dealing with the current situation.
I think we face a few specific challenges in the present that weren't there for gay communities confronting the AIDS crisis. While straight communities and straight people are often documented as having been terrified of even casual contact with someone HIV positive for fear of catching it, from the literature I've read, gay communities tended to have a pretty strong awareness of what was broadly likely to be more or less safe. So there was a lot more room for gathering in spaces and physical demonstration and confrontation that for disabled people might be too risky in the moment. I think one of the things we need to do is look back at the history of direct action from disabled people and what has been successful. I'm thinking of people padlocking themselves to buses and parking in front of buses to protest lacks of ramps. And indeed, much of the backdrop of the disability rights movement was very physical, present, direct action. Even the anti-ATOS protests, Black Triangle, etc. It feels almost like people have become a bit protest fatigued in the past couple of years, especially with everything around Brexit, and there's a lot less space for that radical direct action. And from my reading, I found that there needs to be a balance between that and people who are perceived as reasonable inside the room pushing to shift the over to the window. If you don't give us reasonable people the small things we're asking for, you might have to give those dangerous protesters the big things they're asking for, but as a coordinated and controlled strategy to ensure that the movement is happy with the wins it's fighting for. And organisations like ACT UP, which was a very big organisation around the AIDS epidemic and medical response to that in America, were very good at leveraging this, some people banging on the door from outside, some people sitting around the table inside dynamic. And it's something that I think needs replicating. I'm interested to see the new Disability Commission that's being set up by the think tank that originally proposed universal credit, because it has quite a lot of prominent disabled people who've been critical of the government in the past, such as Tanni Gray-Thompson, I think Baroness Campbell, Jane Campbell, and Lord Shinquin, whose first name I've forgotten. So I'm interested to see whether that allows the expansion of people inside the room to put pressure on the government and make more room for people outside the room to make noise, and the two things to develop a symbiotic relationship. I think the AIDS crisis, there was a lot of very well organised, tight strategizing, and that maybe we're missing that at the moment.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how those things develop. I've been a great admirer of Tanni Gray-Thompson in the last few years, speaking out politically. I think that you're bringing us back to that literature by Paul Monette and Mark Doty is really valuable at this time. It's kind of important time for reflection on what we do now to come together to confront the current situation.
On needless deaths as a result of government inaction, and on the important things that art can do in response to that.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Jamie. It's been great talking to you.
And you, thank you so much.
And I look forward to seeing where your research into reading AIDS literature takes you next.
There are a few different directions. I'll definitely keep you up to date.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.